In Race and Disability, From Analogy to Intersectionality, Angela Frederick and Dara Schiffer observe that the intersection of race and disability has been particularly neglected. Intersectional and critical race scholarship has rarely tended to disability, and writings on racism often deploy disability metaphors. For instance, racial oppression is described as crippling or paralyzing, and the phrase colorblind is widely used. Similarly, critical disability studies and disability activism have neglected race and have been dominated by the perspectives and experiences of disabled white people. Indeed, disabled people of color have described critical disability studies as white critical disability studies, echoing women of color feminists who have described mainstream feminism as white feminism. When the intersection of disability and race is considered at all, it is usually limited to the observation that racialized people are likely to be poor, and poverty often results in poor health, and so racialized people are more likely to be disabled than white people. Racialized people are also more likely than middle class and white people to have jobs where workplace accidents and repetitive strain injuries are common, such as slaughterhouse and meatpacking work, and thus to become disabled in the workplace. This, of course, makes it particularly unfortunate that it is relatively affluent white people who have dominated critical disability studies. Frederick and Schiffer also argue that race and ability are frequently understood as analogous within disability activism and scholarship. However, these analogies continue to assume that people of color are able-bodied and able-minded, and that disabled people are white. As Frederick and Schiffer note, although disabled people have always resisted oppression and advocated for their rights, they historically did so according to the disability label that they were assigned. For instance, deaf people advocated for the deaf, blind people advocated for the blind, wheelchair users demanded ramps, and so forth. There was not an umbrella disability rights movement until the 1970s. Disability activism emerged as a more united movement at this time as a direct extension of the civil rights movement, as African Americans had fought and continued to fight against the stigmatization, discrimination, segregation, marginalization, and institutionalization, primarily in prisons, of Black people, so did disabled people begin to fight against their own stigmatization, discrimination, segregation, marginalization, and institutionalization, with, in their case, this institutionalization occurring in residential homes and residential schools, asylums and hospitals, as well as prisons. Just as African Americans sought a racial desegregation of schools, so did disabled people argue against the segregation of disabled children in special schools and classrooms. Building upon the example of the civil rights movement, disability activists conceptualized disabled people as a minority group that was discriminated against, and civil rights protections for disabled people were approached as extensions of civil rights protections for people of color. This is also true of other liberation movements, including second-wave feminism, LGBTQ activism, and even animal liberation. In each case, racial oppression is taken as the paradigm of oppression, and other marginalized or minoritized groups, or those fighting on their behalf, have sought legal protection against discrimination and violence by way of analogy between the experiences of these groups and those of people of color. As Frederick and Schiffer note, the legal system, relying as it does on the precedent set by prior legislation, all but requires social justice activists to make analogical arguments if what they are seeking is protection and equality under the law. As Frederick and Schiffer argue, while the disability is like race argument was important in making legislative gains, it also has limitations. For one thing, they observe that for disabled people of color, disability and racial oppression may be inextricable from one another or co-constitutive in various ways, and it is only for white disabled people that disability and racial oppression can be separated out and compared. Frederick and Schiffrer describe an example of Junius Wilson, a deaf black boy born in North Carolina in 1908, who was sent to a school for the colored, deaf, and blind, where American Sign Language was not even taught. After leaving the school, he was thus not only linguistically isolated from hearing society, but also from the deaf community. While still an adolescent, he was wrongly convicted of rape and institutionalized in a hospital for the colored insane, where he was castrated, forced to work on the hospital's farm, and incarcerated for 76 years, even after legal charges were dropped, a fact that was concealed from him. In this case, disability segregation and institutionalization are not just analogous to racial segregation and institutionalization, since Wilson spent nearly the entirety of his life in institutions of both racial and disability segregation and oppression. Frederick and Schiffrer also give the example of what have been called ugly laws. Ugly laws were municipal ordinances passed at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. These laws forbade people with visible disabilities and bodily abnormalities from begging in the streets on the basis that they were unsightly. White disability activists have critiqued ugly laws for policing and stigmatizing the bodies of people with disabilities, seeing this as analogous to the ways that Black people and women have struggled against racialized and gendered norms of beauty. Yet, seeing the ugly laws as simply analogous to racist and gendered norms of beauty fails to recognize that the ugly laws were deployed primarily against people who were also poor, people of color, women, and sexual minorities, as Frederick and Schiffrer write. By claiming ugly laws as a shared oppression experienced by all disabled people, the disability rights movement and critical disability scholarship have erased the ways these ordinances were constructed and carried out at the intersection of oppressions. Close quote. For these reasons, they argue for an intersectional rather than an analogy approach to race and disability. Frederick and Schiffrer cite a telling study that shows that while blind white people are likely to compare their experiences of blindness to racial discrimination, blind people of color do not analogize their disability to race. This could be because, as Frederick and Schiffrer argue, disability and racial oppression are imbricated in the lives of disabled people of color. However, it could also be because disabled people of color experience disanalogies or differences between ableism and racial oppression as much as or more than they experience disability and race as analogous. This point is illustrated by a poem titled Magic Wand by blind African-American poet Lynn Manning, who passed away in 2015. This is the poem. Quick change artist extraordinaire, I whip out my folded cane and change from black man to blind man with a flick of my wrist. It is a profound metamorphosis from God-gifted wizard of roundball, dominating blackboards across America, to God-gifted idiot savant composer, pounding out chartbusters on a cockeyed whim, from sociopathic gangbanger with death for eyes to all-seeing soul with saintly spirit, from rape-deranged misogynist to poor motherless child, from welfare-rich pimp to disability-rich gimp, and from white man's burden to every man's burden. It is always a profound metamorphosis, whether from cursed by man to cursed by God, or from scriptures condemned to God ordained. My final form is never of my choosing. I only wield the wand. You are the magician. Manning is describing the moment at which, by taking out his cane, he becomes visible as a blind man. Before he reaches for his cane, he is seen as a non-disabled black man, and the ways he is stereotyped and stigmatized as a Black man are in many ways very different from how he is stereotyped and stigmatized when he is recognized as blind. For instance, when he whips out his cane, he goes from being seen as potentially dangerous, a sociopathic gangbanger with death for eyes, a rape-deranged misogynist, to being seen as a saintly sage and pitiable, an all-seeing soul and a motherless child. Manning's poem shows that race and disability can result in contradictory experiences of oppression for him as a blind Black man, differences that he describes not once but twice in the poem as a metamorphosis. At the same time, Manning, as a blind Black man, would not have experienced disability oppression in the same way as a blind white man. The ways that he was stigmatized as a blind Black man were not the same as the ways that blind white men are stigmatized. For instance, Manning observes that the moment his cane exposes him as blind, he is viewed as both man's burden and a God-gifted idiot savant composer pounding out chart busters on a cockeyed whim. A blind white man who takes out his cane is less likely to be assumed to be financially dependent on the welfare state, a burden to society, or to have a Stevie Wonder stereotype projected onto him. Disabled people who are poor and who are people of color are also more likely than middle-class white disabled people to have become disabled as a result of oppression or to experience disability as a consequence of injustice. Middle-class white disabled people are likely to experience oppression due to their disability, but for poor and racialized disabled people, disability often stems from and also compounds pre-existing oppression. For example, in what is called environmental racism, disabling toxic dumps and other environmental pollutants are most likely to be found in or near poor and racialized neighborhoods rather than in or near affluent white suburbs. Poor people and people of color are also more likely to become disabled through unequal access to healthcare, economic injustice, mass incarceration, and war than affluent white people. Police are also particularly likely to shoot and kill Black men with psychiatric disabilities, while white people manifesting similar psychic distress in public are more likely to receive medical care than to be shot. Today, far more people experiencing psychiatric disabilities are incarcerated in prisons, including psychiatric units in prisons, than in hospitals, but people of color with psychiatric disabilities are more likely to be incarcerated than white people with the same psychiatric conditions and to be incarcerated at higher security levels due to racial discrimination at every level of the criminal legal system. As we have seen in previous classes, critical disability studies scholarship and disability activism, dominated by middle-class white people, has been characterized by a rejection of the medical model and a repudiation of cure. Disability is often represented within critical disability studies and disability activism as neutral variation in human bodies and minds, a valuable way of living, and a source of pride. As Frederick and Schiffer observe, however, it is easier to experience disability this way if you are a middle-class white person with a congenital disability or who became disabled by chance than it is for someone who became disabled as a result of structural oppression such as environmental racism, war, gun, and gang violence, police brutality, a racist juridical legal system, or economic injustice, including the inability to access quality medical care. Disabled people may want medical treatment or cure, but not be able to access it due to racial oppression in many forms. As Frederick and Schiffer write, there is a privilege in being able to call for a distancing from the biomedical regime, a privilege not enjoyed by those whose oppression has included denial of medical care, close quote. For these reasons, as the authors argue, an intersectional approach is necessary. Critical disability studies scholars and disability activists need to be attending to race in their discussions of disability, and critical race scholars and anti-racism activists need to be attending to disability in their discussions of race.